morning and welcome to today's state and federal program directors meeting. This is the first meeting for the 24-25 school year. And we want to welcome all of you that are returning back. And also we want to have a warm welcome to those of you that are new to this position or new to this meeting. I'm Adrienne Balcazar, and I would like to introduce the amazing team of the LCAP State and Federal Programs Unit. Today, we have with us Debbie Cano, and I'm going to stop so you can say hello.
Hi, everybody.
Helen Choi.
Morning, everyone.
Augustine Garcia.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome back.
Rachel Garcia.
Good morning, everyone.
Jeannie Keith.
Good morning, everyone.
Anita Lomeli.
Okay, I'll say buenos dias todos.
And new to our team, Laurel Estrada.
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here.
I also want to introduce our amazing support staff, Maribel Leyva and April Grease. You ladies can
Good morning. Good morning.
Great. To access today's presentation, we ask you to click on the link in the chat, and this will take you directly to the slides. If you use the link at the top of this slide, it'll take you to the Canvas page, and the presentation can be accessed through the icon as shown here, as well as the agenda and resources. And if you happen to click at that slide, that link, and it's spinning, you're going to have to click on the link itself, the PDF, and download it to your desktop and open it up through that way. So we noticed it kept spinning. Okay. Today's topics are here on our agenda, starting with federal program compliance. We're going to talk about required notifications, the parents' right to know letter, the 4-week letter, Title I, Part A comparability, the ESSER 3 closeout, the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, also known as LREBG, and these changes that are taking place. And then we will wrap it up with the LCAP update. There's also some looking at the posting requirements, the dashboard upload, and the proposed revisions to the LCAP instructions and the LCAP timeline. And so again, we have a full agenda today, and we are happy that you're all here with us. Please place your questions in the chat box, and we will answer any simple questions if we can. And we will follow up with the written responses in a Q&A that will be emailed to you. We also are recording today's training and will also be posting this on our website. So before we get started with today's meeting, I wanted to let those of you that are new to us in the state and federal program world that our unit creates and provides a state and federal compliance checklist. And if you follow the link on the slide, it takes you to the publications website where you can purchase the district and school level compliance checklists. The way it works is you will receive both of the checklists electronically, and it allows you to personalize it with your own reminders as well. So it's in Word doc format. The district level checklist provides you reminders of the tasks related to managing the state and federal programs. The issue runs all 12 months. The school level checklist is designed to inform your school site administrators of any state and federal program tasks that need to be accomplished in order to run effective and compliant programs. This particular issue runs from September through June. So as we begin this year's state and federal programs meeting series, I want to take this moment to ground us in the mindset around communication and collaboration. Our meetings are filled with so much important information and critical deadlines on the state and federal programs that we're asking you this year to be intentional about what do you do with the information. We know that our work is easier and better when we collaborate with others at our sites. This takes communication and a process to follow to ensure that the information you receive at our meetings is shared with others. So we ask you to take a moment to think about who else at your district and schools need to know the information that we share at our meetings. And secondly, what's your process to share the information about the state and federal programs with the folks in your district or charter school? How does your process support the superintendent, the board, the district staff, students, and families to understand the intent and purpose of the state and federal programs and the requirements? And lastly, how does this process support the LEA to coordinate the use of state and federal programs to address the disparity of outcomes for specific student groups? So let's talk about federal program compliance and some updates. Here's another aspect to reflect on. Do you and others know the purpose of the programs that you have in your organization? You see here the 4 title programs, but there are so many other state programs and other federal programs that exist in your district or your charter school. And so again, does everyone have a clear understanding of the main purpose? And so for the title programs, the main purpose is to increase student achievement and provide a fair, equal, high-quality education for all students. Each of these programs targets specific student groups or aspects of a student's education. And it's important that we all understand this is the why we do what we do. The implementation of your federal programs is dependent on your timeline. Having a timeline is critical because this guides the activities at the district and site level. When is the planning, the implementing, and the monitoring and evaluating taking place for each of your federal programs? Is everyone aware of the timelines? So there is the planning. Planning usually takes place at the beginning or in the summertime because, again, you need to be aware of everything, all the requirements and how it fits in with your day-to-day activities. Then, once the planning has been completed, it's the implementation. And so this is happening throughout the school year because the students need to be receiving the services. And then towards the end of the year is the monitoring and the evaluating of the effectiveness of your programs. And perhaps there needs to be some modifications or some removals or some additional services that need to be added. And so this process is fluid, and this process needs to be continuously focused on continuous improvement. And again, we always remind everyone that what motivates us and the why is it's about the students, and it's not to be seen as a pot of money. When we get questions saying, principals asking, can I spend it on this? We always go back to, well, what does the needs assessment, if it's a school-wide program, what do the students need, and has it gone through all the formal processes that the CDE and the federal guidance has put in place? So again, we just want to, we can't stress enough that your title monies, and it's not a pot of money. These are programs that you're implementing within your schools. So as you are monitoring and evaluating your federal programs, the CDE also has the responsibility to review your federal programs. And this is called the Federal Program Monitoring Review. It's also known as the FPM Review. And the purpose of the FPM Review is to ensure that you are spending the funding as required by law. This is the FPM cycle here by school year. As shown for each LEA, the cycle is every 2 years, alternating from online and on-site. All of the LEAs in the state are placed in one of the 4 groups or cohorts, as they call them, in A, B, C, and D. So for the 24-25 school year, if you're in cycle A, you were potentially up for online review, and cycle C was up for the on-site review. This year's LEAs and charters that have been selected are highlighted in yellow, and this is reflective of the LA County districts and charter schools. You can see how the state groups by the LEA by regions, such as the East San Gabriel Valley LEAs or the West San Gabriel LEAs. So they group them geographically. The table shown here identifies the components of the FPM review within each of the different formats, whether it's online or on-site. In regards to face-to-face FPM review activities, if you're selected for an online review, you will just be uploading your program evidence in the California Monitoring Tool, which is also called the CMT. This is CDE's system to house the evidence for review. And if you are selected for an on-site review, in addition to uploading the evidence to the CMT, you will also participate in an entrance meeting, employee interviews, interviews with the school site council, the ELAC, the DLAC advisory committee interviews, and an exit meeting. Here are the programs for the 24-25 reviews that an LEA might be or may be selected for review. I also want to point out that the civil rights, I checked last night, the civil rights review, the neglected or delinquent, and the Title IV support, student support and academic enrichment instruments, these still, the 24-25 instruments have not been posted yet, but they are coming soon. So we'll be on the lookout for that. This year, the CDE provided a virtual FPM training that was held on July 31st and went through to August 6th. All of the resources and materials for FPM can be found in CDE's box at this link. And so we want to encourage everyone to earmark this link. We want to make sure that everyone uses this link to have access to all the presentations and the resource materials. This is where you'll find the most up-to-date information, and sometimes it's not even posted on CDE's website. You'll find it in here. So if you do go on to CDE's website and you look for something that you know is there but needs to be updated, we are really encouraging everyone to, after the CDE website, go to the box and see if you can find it in the respective folders for those programs. And you'll find the most up-to-date information. I also want to mention that on September, that we are hosting in February, February 6th, Thursday, we are hosting an in-person meeting, FPM training. And so this too will be open to anyone. I know there's been a lot of requests for people to want to get together in person. And so if you're available and inclined, please join us on this day. It will be an in-person training. It will be all in one room, so there'll be different presenters. So it won't be like previous ones where you jumped from room to room. But our agenda will be coming out soon, so you'll be able to see which programs will be presenting, and you can plan accordingly. As I conclude with this section, I want us to reflect on what are compliant programs. Often we share the notifications of findings, and in November, I will continue sharing those most common findings. But I ask you this time today to reflect on what is a compliant program. Are you implementing compliant programs? Do you have a strong system in place? Do your procedures include an organized framework that everyone is knowledgeable about and that you've trained everyone in? Because ultimately, you have to ask yourself, are your students and families being harmed by not having compliant programs? What specific needs of students are not being met? What are your overarching goals for students, for your staff, for your parents, and your family? And so as we look forward to this new year, we ask you to, again, this is the time that you can set up, make some modifications to your system. As you reflect on what worked last year, what didn't work, perhaps there are areas now that you feel you can move forward on and make some changes. So again, we want to welcome you to this new school year. And now Debbie will continue with sharing about some required notifications.
Great. Thank you, Adrienne. Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. So we're going to start off right now with some important required notifications. I'm going to review 4 different required notifications: the UCP annual notice, parents' rights to know letter, 4-week letter, and the notice regarding educational rights of homeless children and youth. Next slide, please. Okay, so our first required notification is the Uniform Complaint Procedure Annual Notice. And we're starting out with this new document, though. This is a new document that the CDE just published at the end of July 2024. So it's fresh off the presses. And it's pictured here. And there's also a link to it up on the CDE's website. And this pamphlet can be used to provide clear information with the ins and the outs of the Uniform Complaint Procedure. And this is a great resource to help ground staff and parents in understanding the Uniform Complaint Procedures. LEAs are required to annually notify in writing its educational partners of their UCP process. And this pamphlet is not the required notification, but it can be sent with the notification to provide information to parents. Next slide, please. Okay, so here on this slide is the sample template for the Uniform Complaint Procedure, or UCP, annual notice. LEAs are required to annually notify in writing its educational partners of their UCP process. This includes notifying students, employees, parents or guardians, district and school advisory committees, such as your ELAC or your school site council or your district ELAC or your DLAC, and other committees, as well as private school officials and other interested parties. On this slide, you can see a screenshot of the sample UCP annual notice and the link to the CDE sample. LEAs are not required to use this particular sample. However, this sample does require everything that does contain everything that is required in this notification. And we had this discussion yesterday. I think best practice is to use the template that is provided for you. However, if you want to create your own, it's a good idea to send it to the UCP office at the CDE and have them review it and give approval of it before you send it out to parents. And just as a reminder, the critical required component of this annual notice, you must include the title of the position responsible for processing the complaints and the name and the contact information of the person currently in that position. Okay, next slide, please. Our next required notification is the parent's right to know letter. This notification is required for LEAs receiving Title I Part A funds. So each LEA receiving these Title I Part A funds must notify the parents of each student attending these schools that they may request the professional qualification of the student's classroom teachers, and that the district will provide upon that request and in a timely manner that information. This notice must be sent at the beginning of each school year. We've included a link to a CDE sample parents' right to know letter that LEAs may use to meet this requirement. And this requirement is also monitored through the FPM process in 2 programs, in Comp Ed item 8 and also supporting effective instruction item 13. Next slide, please. Next, and again, this is for the schools receiving Title I funds, the 4-week letter. So this is a little different, and this is contingent on if a child has been taught for 4 or more consecutive weeks by a teacher who does not meet applicable state certification or licensure requirements at the grade level and the subject area, the LEA must inform the parents of each child from that classroom where the teacher is assigned. This notification must be sent in a timely manner. So if the district knows that the teacher's assignment will go beyond a 4-week period, they should be proactive and prepare this letter to be sent at that 4-week mark. This notice only needs to be sent to the parents of the students in that classroom, not school-wide. So our next slide will help you identify which teachers would require this notification. Next slide, please. So here, this chart highlights the criteria for determining if the 4-week letter is triggered. As you can see in the chart, if the teacher holds a clear life level 1, level 2 intern, supplementary subject matter, or preliminary credential in the grade level and subject areas in which the teacher is providing instruction, then no, the 4-week letter is not triggered. However, the 4-week letter is triggered if the teacher is falling within the ineffective or out of field or emergency substitute realm. And you can read the chart here that would describe that criteria. So this is aligned to the information from the CDE on their website, and you can find additional information on the updated definitions at the link provided on the slide. And the 4-week letter is also monitored through the FPM process in both Comp Ed and Supporting Effective Instruction. Next slide, please. Okay, and lastly, there's a notice that is regarding the educational rights of children and youth experiencing homelessness. LEAs are required to ensure that public notice of educational rights of children and youth experiencing homelessness is disseminated at locations frequented by parents and guardians of homeless children and youth and an unaccompanied youth, including locations such as schools, shelters, public libraries, and food pantries. The CDE has posters that are translated in various languages outlining the educational rights of children, and the LEAs can download those. We've included a screenshot of the CDE poster on the slide as well as a link to the poster. The CDE also has guidance documents for dissemination, the educational rights that provide some best practices and strategies to consider. We've also included the link for this guidance to the CDE resources. It's also important to note that the LEA must inform school personnel, service providers, advocates working with homeless families and parents or guardians of homeless students. Additionally, the list of liaisons in the LEA and their contact information must be posted on the LEA's website, along with specific information on homelessness, including information on the educational rights and resources available to persons experiencing homelessness. The public notice regarding educational rights of homeless children and the notice regarding the LEA liaison duties, including the posting requirement, is monitored through the FPM process in the Homeless Education Program instrument. And that's it for me today. And now to Rachel.
Thank you, Debbie. Good morning, everyone. So in this next section, we're going to be reviewing Title I, Part A, comparability requirements. Okay, so LEAs receiving Title I, Part A funds must demonstrate that all schools are providing comparable services using both state and local funds. And so the purpose of this requirement is to ensure that LEAs provide at least the same amount of funding to schools receiving Title I funds as they do to their non-Title I schools. And so comparability calculations are required to be done on an annual basis, and they are completed at the district level on a school-by-school basis. Additionally, the calculations must be done in a timely manner, and this is to ensure that all schools are in a comparable position and to allow the district to make any needed adjustments with the least amount of disruption, in order to avoid the loss of Title I funding. Next slide, please. So to meet the comparability requirements, LEAs are required to file a written assurance with the state, also develop procedures for compliance with the comparability requirements, and maintain records demonstrating comparability calculations are done on an annual basis. And when completing these calculations, LEAs must confirm that the student to full-time equivalent teacher ratios fall within a reasonable variance. And so in California, this has been determined to be a 30% variance. So as mentioned on the previous slide, LEAs are required to file a written assurance with the state. And so this is done through the spring consolidated application when LEAs complete and submit the certification of assurances form. And so through the certification of this form, LEAs are assuring that they have established and implemented a district-wide salary schedule, as well as policies to ensure equivalence among schools in staffing and in the provision of materials and supplies. And so here on this slide, you can see a screenshot of all of the legal assurances that are included in the Spring CONAP. And then the second screenshot is a screenshot of the specific comparability assurances. So LEAs must develop written procedures for compliance with comparability requirements. And so the procedures should include the LEA's timeline and the process for demonstrating comparability. Also, the office responsible for completing these calculations, and a description of how and when any adjustments are made in schools that are not comparable. LEAs must maintain source documentation to support the comparability calculations, as well as any documentation related to any adjustments made to staffing to ensure comparability. And so it's required that LEAs maintain this documentation for 3 years after the completion of the activity for which funds were used. However, it's recommended that LEAs maintain this documentation for 5 years, but the requirement is 3 years. So when completing these calculations, LEAs must use student enrollment to full-time equivalent teacher ratios to determine whether or not schools are comparable. And so the calculations can be done in one of 2 ways, either by comparing all schools within the LEA as a whole, or by comparing all schools within the LEA by each grade span group. And so as previously mentioned, the student to full-time equivalent teacher ratios must fall within a 30% variance. And so if schools are not comparable, then the LEA must make adjustments to ensure that all schools are in a comparable position. And so completing these calculations early enough in the school year will allow the LEA to make any needed adjustments with the least amount of disruption. And so CDE has recommended that LEAs complete these calculations and make any necessary adjustments by October 31st of each year. So there are several exclusions that LEAs may use when determining comparability. And so first off, LEAs are not required to include any unpredictable changes that occur after the beginning of the school year, such as changes in student enrollment or personnel assignments. Also, schools with 200 or fewer students may be excluded from the calculations. If the LEA is a single school LEA or only has 1 school for each grade span group, then the comparability requirements also do not apply. LEAs may also exclude state or local funds that are expended for language instruction programs and the excess cost of providing services to students with disabilities. And then lastly, LEAs may exclude state and local funds expended under SS Section 1113B1D and 1113C2B for programs that meet the intent and purposes of Title I, Part A. And so in addition to the exclusions that were referenced on the previous slide, there are also several school types that are exempt from meeting the comparability requirements. And so this includes alternative schools of choice, continuation high schools, county community schools, district community day schools, juvenile court schools, opportunity schools, public special education schools, and also youth authority schools. So the CDE has developed calculation forms to assist LEAs in determining comparability. And so here on the slide, you can see a screenshot of one of the forms. And so the forms are in Excel format, and they basically provide LEAs with immediate information on whether or not the school meets comparability through either of the options that were previously mentioned, so LEA-wide or by grade span group. And so the calculation forms and instructions, as well as other related resources, are available on the CDE website at the link that we've provided on the slide. So when completing these forms, LEAs need to enter the school name, the school type, the grade span group code, student enrollment information for each school, and the total full-time equivalent teachers for all schools. And so it's for all schools that are included in the school students counts report in the CARS. And so the last two columns in the forms will automatically populate based on the student enrollment and full-time equivalent teacher information that's entered. And so that last column will indicate whether or not the school is comparable. If you calculate comparability based on one method, such as the LEA-wide average, and find that a school is not comparable, then it's recommended that you try the other option. So that would be the grade span group average to determine comparability. And so if after trying both of the options, if you find that a school is still not comparable, then that's where the LEA would need to make adjustments in order to ensure that all schools are comparable. And so one important thing to remember when completing these calculations is that the student enrollment data and the full-time equivalent teacher data must be captured on the same date for every school within the LEA. And so you'll want to maintain documentation that this data is captured on the same date. And then another important reminder is that the calculations should only include teachers whose salaries are paid using state and local funds. So if you have any teachers who are split funded, then you would calculate the FTE using only the percentage of the salary that's paid out of state or local funds. Okay, so here we have an example of a completed comparability form based on the LEA-wide average. And so in this example, you can see in the last column that middle school A is not comparable. And so in this case, you would try the other option, which is by the grade span group average. Again, as mentioned, the calculation forms are in Excel format. And so once you enter the information in the LEA-wide average tab, it will auto-populate that same information for you for each school into the grade span group tabs. So you won't have to enter this information again. Another thing you can see in this example is that 2 schools are exempt as indicated in that last column. So elementary school C is exempt because it has less than 200 students. And high school B is exempt because it is a continuation school. And so the form will also auto-populate the last column with exempt if the school meets those exemptions or those exclusions that were indicated. Okay, in this next example, we see the forms based on the grade span group average, and it has the same elementary and middle school data that was included on the previous slide. And so the first screenshot shows the elementary grade span group, and then the second screenshot shows the middle school grade span group. And so you can see that by using the grade span group average option, the middle school A is now comparable. And so in this example, it worked out for middle school A using the other option, so the grade span group option. But if after trying both options, you still have a school that's not comparable, then that's where the LEA would need to make adjustments in order to meet comparability requirements. So it's important for LEAs to establish a timeline to determine comparability. And so as previously mentioned, early determination allows the LEA to make adjustments with the least amount of disruption. So again, it's recommended that LEAs complete these calculations and make any needed changes in staffing by October 31st of each year. And for your reference, the CDE has provided a sample timeline for determining comparability, and we've included the link to this timeline at the bottom of the slide. So comparability requirements are monitored through the FPM process, specifically in the compensatory education instrument, item number 14. And so evidence requests for this item include the completed comparability calculation forms, also the current district-wide salary schedule, the LEA's policies to ensure equivalence among schools and teachers, administrators, and other staff, and also the policy to ensure equivalence among schools in the provision of materials and supplies. And so if your LEA receives Title I Part A funds, it will be important that you verify that your LEA has these required policies and procedures in place, and that these calculations are being completed on an annual basis, and that any adjustments are being made if you have any schools that are not comparable. And so that concludes this section. So I will now turn it over to Helen.
Thank you, Rachel, and good morning, everyone. My name is Helen Choi, and I'm thrilled to be here with you today. We got some important reminders about ESSER 3 to go over, so let's dive right in. So it's really hard to believe that it's been already 4 years since COVID shifted our world, right? So as you know, there were various acts that supported efforts to ensure students didn't lose valuable learning time. One of the last was the American Rescue Plan Act, which brought us ESSER 3. So now here we are. The obligation deadline is next week. That's right, September 30th, 2024 is just around the corner. And so later on, we'll also discuss the liquidation process in the next few slides. So since we're on the topic of obligation liquidation, I just want to take a moment to review what the obligation periods for spending federal funds. Understanding when an obligation is made is crucial, so we have prepared a table that outlines the timeline for when a state or subgrantee must make obligations for various types of property and services. The guidelines for these obligations can be found in 34 CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, 76.707. And we've included a direct link to this regulation on the slide for your reference. This chart provides a clear breakdown of the obligation timelines for different types of property and services. This information is particularly important as you approach the end of the obligation period. And for our case, it's next week, right? For instance, if the obligation involves personnel services from a contractor who is not an employee, the obligation occurs on the date when the grantee makes a binding written commitment to secure those services. In contrast, for travel-related expenses, the obligation is considered fulfilled when the travel actually takes place. Once an obligation is made, you have 90 days to liquidate the funds. In simpler terms, liquidation means settling the bill. So therefore, once you have a binding agreement or contract to pay for a service, the actual payment constitutes the liquidation, and this payment must be completed within that 90-day period. So now back to ESSER 3. So remember, just like with ESSER 2, for ESSER 3, all expenditures must meet these 3 key criteria. First, they must prevent, prepare for, or respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. 2, they need to align with at least one of the allowable uses of funds of the fund source. And finally, they must be reasonable and necessary to the program's purpose, following all relevant cost principles outlined in the Uniform Grants Guidance. And if your LEA has remaining funds, we recommend reviewing all expenditures dating back to March 13th, 2020 to identify any allowable expenses that could be attributed to ESSER 3 resources. For example, an LEA might identify staffing costs such as salaries dating back to March 13, 2020. These expenditures were originally covered by a non-stimulus funding source. The staff could include teachers addressing lost instructional time in their classrooms and custodians ensuring classrooms are sanitized daily in response to the pandemic. If these expenditures meet all of the ESSER 3 criteria, they may be allowable. In fact, allowable expenditures all the way back to March 13, 2020 can be transferred into ESSER 3 resources. And finally, as mentioned earlier, standard liquidation deadline is January 28, 2025. However, there is an opportunity to apply for a liquidation extension. The application requires documentation of a binding written agreement by September 30th, 2024. And a few important things to note is that this approval is required from both the U.S. Department of Education and the CDE. And this approval applies only to the liquidation deadline, not the obligation deadline. So more information on liquidation extension requests can be found via the link on this slide. The completed application and supporting documentation must be submitted via email to the CDE Federal Stimulus Team at edrelieffunds@cde.ca.gov. And the applications are due by November 1st, 2024. And please note that any application submitted after this date will not be considered, and the LEA may be required to find an alternative funding source for these expenditures. And thank you, and that wraps up this section. And now I'll turn it over to Anita. Take it away.
Thank you, Helen. In this section, we will review the original purpose of the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, and then go over recent and significant legislative updates and changes to the grant. Okay, as a quick overview of the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, you probably recall that as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic emergency, funds in the amount of several $1 billion statewide were apportioned to LEAs at the beginning of the 22-23 school year with the purpose to assist in the recovery efforts, supporting academics, as well as pupil and staff social emotional well-being. These one-time LREBG funds can support the LEAs through the end of the 27-28 school year. Eligible LEAs for the funds are school districts, county offices of education, and charter schools. Now, if you're wondering how much of the billions of dollars did your LEA receive through the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, you can click on the link found at the bottom of the slide for that information. Now, to provide some perspective on the changes and updates around the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant, let's take a look at its legislative history and the timeline. The California Budget Act of 2022 added Ed Code Section 32526, establishing the block grant, and it provided allocations to LEAs. And across the state, it was about $7.9 billion to be expended for the purpose mentioned in the previous slide. The following year, the Budget Act of 2023 reduced the original apportionment by about 14.3%. And over the course of several months in the fall of 2023, the state was able to recover the overpayment of funds from LEAs. But nevertheless, the amount provided to LEAs statewide was still significant at about $6.5 billion. Then in February of this year, the lawsuit that was originally brought against the state of California back in November of 2020 was settled. And the settlement promised legislation that included grant allocation, administration, learning recovery resources, and assistance towards helping students most negatively affected by the pandemic learning loss in our schools. And thus, the California Budget Act of 2024 amended Ed Code Section 32526 by adding new requirements to the grant, including a needs assessment that would identify the students needing the most support. And so, following California's Budget Act of 2024, Senate Bill 153, also known as the Education Omni-Budget Trailer Bill, or the instructions to make sense of this all, accompanied the state's budget and outlined specific statutory changes and appropriations to the LREBG and Ed Code 32526. And so what are those updates and changes? First, Ed Code now explicitly requires that learning supports and actions funded with the LREBG funds be evidence-based. Next, additional allowable uses of funds were included, and as well as the submission of an interim expenditure report for the funds expended during the 22-23 and the 23-24 fiscal years. In addition, beginning with the 25-26 school year, which is next school year, the LEAs who still have remaining LREBG funds will be required to conduct a needs assessment and include the funds in the LEA's LCAP. This update will be in effect through the 27-28 school year if the LEA still has unexpended LREBG funds. The 27-28 school year will conclude the full run of the one-time Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant. Now, you may have questions right about now about how this will look like in the LCAP. And the LCAP template for the upcoming school year. And we anticipated that you would have those questions. So just know that a little bit later in this presentation, Jeannie and Augustine will provide some additional information on the statutory changes as it relates specifically to the LCAP and the LCAP instructions. So in the meantime, let's go over the changes to the allowable uses with some specific information. To begin, there are 6 purposes for which the LREBG funds can be expended according to the law. So let's start with A. These include expanding instructional time, whether that's by increasing the number of school days or minutes, providing summer school or intersessional instructional programs, or decreasing staff to pupil ratios based on student learning needs. A change to this allowable use category is that the actions here must be identifiable as evidence-based, and hence the green icon with the magnifying glass. B, accelerating progress to close learning gaps by providing tutoring services, providing early intervention and literacy programs to students in preschool through grade 3, or implementing learning recovery programs to accelerate pupil academic proficiency or English language proficiency. Actions and services in this category must also be evidence-based. And in addition to this, professional development and coaching provided to staff for math, ELA, and/or ELD frameworks was added to the Ed Code as an allowable use of funds. C, integrating pupil supports to address barriers to learning by providing health services, counseling, access to school meal programs, before and after school programs, or referrals to support family or student needs. These must also be evidence-based. D, access to instruction for credit deficiency students to complete graduation or grade promotion requirements and to increase or improve student college eligibility remains the same. E, additional academic services for pupils, such as diagnostic progress monitoring and benchmark assessments of pupil learning, also remains the same. F, this category is newly added and requires LEAs to conduct a needs assessment prior to determining how the LREBG funds will be expended beginning in the 25-26 school year. So if you're wondering, okay, well, what's included in subdivision D? We will learn more about it and the needs assessment on the next slide. So here we go. Ed Code section 32526D1 provides detailed requirements on the needs assessment that must take place for the LREBG funds to be expended beginning in the 25-26 school year, next year. LEAs are tasked with identifying pupils with the greatest need of learning recovery supports and interventions. The needs assessment must include a review of the following metrics: the academic performance in English language arts and math across the LEA and school sites based on student groups in the very low or low status on the California dashboard. Also, chronic absenteeism at the LEA and school site levels based on student groups in the very high or high status level on the California dashboard. And you are correct if you are thinking red and orange on the dashboard. LEAs may also include local metrics as part of their needs assessment, and LREBG funds may be used to contract with a third party to develop or otherwise support the development of the needs assessment with an LEA. LEAs are encouraged to contract or partner with community-based organizations with a track record of success in serving high-needs students to deliver the services or programs identified as a result of the needs assessment. And so a few updates to a change, the interim expenditure reporting. So pursuant to Ed Code section 32526E1, LEAs receiving the LREBG apportionments shall report to CDE using a template developed by CDE and make the report publicly available on their websites. So LEAs who received LREBG apportionments are required to report interim expenditures of those apportioned funds from the 22-23 and the 23-24 fiscal years. Now, you may remember that originally the expenditure reporting was to take place annually, but now future expenditure reports have shifted into the LCAP. And even if your LEA has not expended any LREBG funds thus far, you must still submit an interim expenditure report to CDE. The report is due to the CDE by December 15th of this year. The report must be completed on a template developed by the CDE and submitted on the Grant Management and Reporting Tool, also known as GMART. And lastly, LEAs must make the interim expenditure report publicly available on their website. Today is a good time to follow up with colleagues at the district office who have a part in the LREBG funds and register for an upcoming CDE webinar on the interim report. The webinar is next Tuesday at 10 a.m. and a link to the registration is included on this slide. Now we've come to the last but not the least of the changes to the LREBG, and it's the LCAP integration. As previously mentioned, these changes are directly connected to a litigation settlement agreement reached by parties in the case of Kayla J. et al. Versus the state of California. Beginning in the 25-26 LCAP, that's next year, LEAs expending LREBG funds must address 6 requirements added to Ed Code 52064.4 over an LCAP land where it's with the other 5200s. Actions supported with LREBG funding must remain in the LCAP until the LEA has expended the remainder of the LREBG funds. LEAs will be required to identify at least one metric for each action funded with LREBG funds. And based on the needs assessment, LEAs will need to articulate the rationale for selecting the specific action to address learning recovery. In addition, the action description will need to explain how research supports each action that must be evidence-based, and it requires that county offices of education be ready and willing to offer school districts technical assistance in conducting the required needs assessment and support the annual update process. And finally, in the 27-28 LCAP, LEAs will evaluate the overall effectiveness of the LREBG actions and adjust the supports accordingly. Now, Jeannie and Augustine will go over into more depth on the impact to the LCAP shortly. And so with all of this new information, you're probably creating a to-do list right now. And here are some important next steps. Register for the October 1st webinar and invite other esteemed colleagues who will be involved with the interim expenditure report to attend with you if possible. Calendar the interim expenditure report submission on your calendar that is due by December 15th. The 15th is a Sunday. So really the Friday before the Sunday is actually Friday the 13th. So maybe you want to plan to submit the report the day before Friday the 13th. Plan and prepare to ensure that the report is posted on the LEA's internet website by December 15th as well. And as you are diligently implementing the 24-25 LCAP right now, it's never too early to begin thinking about the development of the 25-26 LCAP. Determine if you have remaining LREBG funds and how much. Plan how and when the needs assessment will be conducted and where evidence-based actions, services, or strategies will be vetted with pertinent research. Okay, so we've come to the end of this section, and I hope that you're ready for a quick check for understanding. And so here is the question. Your LEA received their LREBG apportionment, but has not utilized any of the funds just yet. You know, there's ESSER 3 funds, there's all these other funds. Does your LEA need to submit an interim expenditure report to CDE by December 15th, 2024? Please place your answers in the chat. Okay, let's turn the slide. And you are correct. If you answered yes, good job. If you received LREBG funds, whether or not you have spent it all, just some of it, or nothing at all, the interim expenditure report must be submitted to CDE by the due date. Thank you for all for participating. This concludes this section. Thank you for your attention. And next up is Augustine, who will provide an update on the 24-25 LCAP.
Awesome. Thank you, Anita. Happy Thursday, everyone. So this morning, Jeannie and I are happy to share the latest LCAP updates with you. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with our LCAP posting requirements. As a friendly reminder, all LEAs must post their board-adopted LCAP on their website. This slide highlights the applicable ed codes related to the posting requirements for school districts and charter schools. So for both school districts and charter schools, the LCAP must be posted as one single document with all of the required components in the following order. There's the budget overview for parents, that'll be first, followed by the 23-24 LCAP annual update and instructions, then the 24-25 LCAP, which includes plan summary, engage in educational partners, goals and actions, and the increased or improved services section. Next would be the action tables, and finally the LCAP template instructions. It's important to note that school districts are also required to post on their website the LCAPs of charter schools authorized by the school district per Ed Code 52065A. We also wanted to share some new posting requirements related to the LCAP that became effective January 1st, 2024 through SB 609. Based on this change in Ed Code, school districts and charter schools are going to have to post their board-adopted, county office-approved LCAP on the California dashboard. This new requirement applies to school districts, charter schools, and county offices of education. And continuing on the topic of uploading the adopted and approved LCAP to the dashboard coordinators will need to upload a PDF of the approved 24-25 LCAP. The upload window will be from October 14th through November 1st, 2024. So please plan to complete your submissions within this time frame. The CDE will provide further information and instructions on how to upload the approved 24-25 LCAP to the 24 dashboard. So please keep an eye out for these updates to make sure the process is completed smoothly. And in addition to guidance from CDE, our colleagues in the Assessment and Data Literacy Unit, led by Evan Bartelheim, will also be reaching out to dashboard coordinators to offer assistance with the upload. And to assist you in meeting the posting requirements found in Ed Code Section 52065, you can find any and all adopted and approved LCAPs by following the link provided on this slide. Once you arrive at laco.edu, you're going to want to click on LCAPs at the top of the page. Once you're at the Los Angeles County LCAPs page, you'll see 3 different buttons containing the approved plans from all prior LCAP cycles available for you to download. All right, let's move on and talk about the revisions to the LCAP instructions. So over the past year, the administration and legislature have made some additional changes through Senate Bill 153, which added California Ed Code Section 52064.4 to require additional revisions to the instructions for the LCAP and the annual update templates. The CDE brought this item to the State Board of Education at its September meeting to receive direction and feedback on the draft LCAP template instructions before bringing it to the request for adoption of the new LCAP template by the State Board at its November 2024 meeting. Important, no revisions are being proposed to the LCAP template itself. The proposed revisions are limited to the revisions required in the instructions for the LCAP template. As a part of this year's state budget, and as Anita mentioned earlier, SB 153 requires changes to the LCAP template instructions for the 25-26, 26-27, and 27-28 LCAPs. These changes center around the use of that Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant funding and requiring LEAs to take additional steps, including conducting that needs assessment to better ensure the funding is going towards improving the outcomes for our most in-need students. So by January 31st, 2025, the LCAP instructions will be revised to include actions related to unexpended LRE BG funds for the 25-26, 26-27, and 27-28 LCAP years. So this requirement applies to years 2 and 3 of this current LCAP cycle, and then year 1 of the 27-28 through 29-30 cycle. And actions funded by these LRE BG funds must stay in the LCAP until the LEA has fully spent the remaining funds, after which they can be removed. So these next 3 slides provide the required changes to the LCAP instructions, requiring an LEA to 1, identify all planned expenditures using LRE BG funds in the LCAP within the description of the actions and analysis of the implementation of those actions in the annual update. 2, identify at least 1 metric to monitor the impact of each action supported with those LRE BG funds. Keep in mind that this may align to an existing metric already in your LCAP. 3, articulate the rationale for selecting actions that implement 1 or more of the purposes identified in Ed Code Section 32526C2, based on the needs assessment required by Ed Code Section 32526D, including the identification of how the selected actions are expected to address the identified areas of need for students or schools identified by that needs assessment. 4, ensure that the action description explains how research supports each selected action based on the identified area or areas of need identified in that needs assessment. And 5, school districts receiving technical assistance pursuant to Ed Code Section 52071 and county offices of education providing technical assistance are encouraged to use the technical assistance process to support school districts in conducting the required needs assessment to select actions supported by LRE-BG funds and or to evaluate the implementation of actions supported by these same funds as a part of the annual update process. So LEAs in LA County will have an opportunity to address this through the differentiated assistance process. And coming soon, as outlined in Ed Code section 52064.4A6, the instructions for the 27-28 LCAP or the annual update to the 26-27 LCAP must include a requirement for LEAs to review the rationale behind actions funded by LRE-BG. This review will help assess the overall effectiveness of these actions and determine whether adjustments are necessary based on progress demonstrated in the relevant metrics. The CDE will incorporate these requirements into the instructions for the 26-27 LCAP annual update template, as this is when the review of the rationale is set to take place. So there are two options that CDE has created to address the LRE-BG requirements in the LCAP instructions. Both of these options can be accessed by clicking on the item 3 link found on this slide. With the revised instructions, there will be related sections of the LCAP that may be impacted, such as the plan summary, the metrics table, and the goals and actions section. And speaking of actions, Anita covered them earlier, but they bear repeating. The allowable uses of LRE-BG funds to address learning recovery initiatives are found in Ed Code section 32526C2A through E, and they include increasing instructional learning time for the 22-23 through 27-28 school years, accelerating progress and closing learning gaps by implementing, expanding, or enhancing evidence-based supports, offering professional development and coaching, integrating supports to address barriers to learning such as mental health services, school meals, before and after school programs, and social emotional learning, providing access to instruction for credit deficient students to meet graduation or grade promotion requirements and improve their college eligibility, offering additional academic services including diagnostic, progress monitoring, and benchmark assessments for student learning, and conducting the required needs assessment under Division C of this same Ed Code. And CDE is seeking feedback on these two options from Ed partners, and that can be done by registering for the October 3rd Thursday at 3 meeting or providing input via email to lcff@cde.ca.gov. So 2 key questions to consider when thinking about your LRE-BG funding are, 1, what remaining funds does your LEA have? And 2, what process will your LEA use for the required needs assessment to determine the actions included in the LCAP for learning recovery initiatives? The geographic lead agencies have developed a needs assessment workbook template, which includes curated evidence-based resources to assist school districts and charter schools in meeting the new LRE-BG requirements. Remember that any LEA anticipating a balance of those LRE-BG funds in the 25-26 school year must initiate the needs assessment during this 24-25 school year. This ensures that identified needs are addressed and evidence-based practices are selected as part of the LCAP development process in collaboration with educational partners. A link to the workbook template is included on this slide for your reference. And now to continue with our section, I'll hand it off to Jeannie.
Thank you, Augustine, and good morning, everyone. I'll continue our update this morning with a resource that focuses on the LEA's LCAP process. For your reference, the 24-25 LCAP timeline document is linked on the slide and posted on our website with LCAP resources. This timeline connects to the grounding questions Adrian posed at the beginning of today's training, in that while the LCAP is a compliance document, the process requires transparency, coordination of resources, and most importantly, input from those closest to the work at the school and district levels. This morning, I'll highlight some of the key recommendations offered in the LCAP process timeline. A timeline visual on the screen here is offered to assist an LEA to organize their process in 3 key phases, which are interdependent and occur over the course of the school year. In the fall, LEAs begin annual implementation of their actions, monitoring expenditures, and monitoring multiple data results at the school and district levels, so they are prepared to determine effectiveness. In this phase, LEAs are also engaging all educational partners and the board with an understanding of what is being implemented, how funds are budgeted, as well as intentionally mapping their annual process to support equity of outcomes targeted in their LCAP. In the winter and early spring, LEAs engaged in a goal analysis for each LCAP goal and present a mid-year update to their governing board by February 28th. These two items or processes collectively inform an LEA's understanding of their needs, bright spots, and use of funds to date, which prepares the LEA to develop a plan in the spring. And then in the spring, LEAs use all of this analysis, including input from educational partners, as well as their projected budgets, to inform the development of their plan for the next year. Within each phase of the LCAP process, the timeline offered for your consideration identifies processes and educational partner engagement that connects to the sections of the LCAP. Each phase identifies strategies for oversight of actions, expenditures, and using multiple data points, including input from educational partners and the board, to reflect on the effectiveness of the plan. Additionally, in each section, the timeline offers a considerations and reflections section that offers questions to assist an LEA's leadership team and cabinet to outline a meaningful and transparent LCAP process. So let's go on to the next slide. And over the next 3 slides, we'll focus on setting up the system in the fall, so the LEA has their information collected in a timely manner and from those closest to the work, so that it can inform the annual goal analysis prompts for each of the LCAP goals. To address implementation, some things to consider are: 1, identifying staff responsible for support, oversight, and progress of specific goals and actions in the LCAP, so your LEA can provide information for the goal analysis. This aligns to the first prompt in the goal analysis, where LEAs describe implementation of actions in each goal, successes and challenges with implementation, and if and how any actions are implemented differently from what was planned in the adopted LCAP. Something to consider here is that given that some actions span across grade spans, your LEA may need to identify how and which staff can share information to address this range of implementation. Additionally, some actions address needs at specific school sites, so it's important to reach out to staff, again, that are closest to the work at these schools and know it best. Let's take a look at the next slide and looking at another key consideration in setting up your system in the fall. This consideration is budget oversight. Identifying fiscal staff to provide budget oversight for expenditures for LCAP actions prepares the LEA to track and report estimated actual expenditures. This also sets up a process to work with program staff to describe any material differences between budgeted expenditures and estimated actuals in the goal analysis. As you know, your fiscal staff will also provide expenditures to date for the mid-year update. And so this should align to the implementation described at the time determined for the expenditures shared in the mid-year report. And now let's take a look at a third component of setting the system up in the fall: identifying staff responsible for monitoring and reporting results for each LCAP goal is a key step in putting a system in place for the LEA to track progress along with implementation and expenditures. Key is establishing a process for collecting data for the identified metrics in the plan, which may be quantitative or qualitative, as well as for administering local assessments and surveys. Staff will need to access sources of data, including dashboard, CalPads, DataQuest, local surveys, as well as local data to inform the level of effectiveness for specific actions in the goal analysis. It's recommended that the LEA also identify how the data will be shared with educational partners in a user-friendly format to support educational partners in providing meaningful input about the effectiveness of the actions. And we'll go on to the next slide here and see a specific section that's called out in the fall timeline. Specifically, this section identifies backwards mapping your LCAP process in the fall from the date of LCAP adoption in June. Even though June is a far way away, it is key to map your process now. To ensure your LEA provides time also for the steps in the LCAP process, we suggest working backwards from a planned board adoption date for the LCAP and the local indicators presentation in June. On this slide, we're also reminding the LEA about the required draft presentation of the LCAP to the required parent advisory committees, and the superintendent's response to comments from these committees, as well as the public hearing for the LCAP and budget. Providing enough time for each of these requirements provides an important opportunity for input and transparency, and for the LEA to gain meaningful feedback. On the next slide, we'll take a look at the section for engaging educational partners. In the fall, the timeline reminds LEAs to establish their Parent Advisory Committee, also known as the PAC, and their English Learner PAC. This supports the committee's understanding of what is included in the plan. You'll see included on the slide also a reminder that LEAs with middle and high school must also include 2 students on the PAC or establish a student advisory committee to participate in the LCAP process. Additionally, in this section for engaging educational partners, to support students, staff, and parents to understand what is in the LCAP and how it supports their school and needs, the timeline suggests the LEA develop a process for leadership or principals to share highlights of the LCAP, so each of the groups are aware of what is planned for implementation, as well as their role in implementation and how they can engage in the LCAP process. Also, you'll see included in this section is the new requirement for LREBG funds that you've heard about today. We encourage you to connect with your cabinet and leadership to determine your process for sharing this with educational partners. And the last section in the timeline addresses the governing board or body. Topics for board updates in the fall are offered in this section. These may include suggestions for updates on, for example, the status of implementation of LCAP goals. Some LEAs provide an update on a set of goals at each meeting. An LEA might also consider highlighting their process for monitoring implementation, expenditures, measuring results, and engaging educational partners. Additionally, recommended is providing an update about the new requirement for the LREBG funding and your LCAP process and timeline. On the next slide, we provide some resources from CDE that will support your LCAP process. And these CDE Tuesdays at 2 and Thursdays at 3 are hosted by Josh Strong and the local agency systems support office at CDE. A link to the CDE webpage where you can sign up for each webinar is included on the slide for your reference. We hope the resources we've shared with you this morning are helpful for your LEA's LCAP process, and we encourage you to share them with your LEA. We also encourage you to reach out to other LEAs and learn about their process. And now, Adrian will now finish up our meeting with some important reminders.
Thank you, Jeannie. So we have some reminders on the next slide. As you can see, these dates, 3 of them are September 30th. So that's right around the corner. Educator Effectiveness Funds, that annual report is due. Literacy Coaches and Reading Specialists Grant Program, that annual report is due on the 30th as well. And Prop 28 Arts and Music in Schools, that annual report is also due on September 30th. In addition to that, the federal stimulus reporting for ESSER 3 and ARP and ELOG, those that reporting opened on the 23rd of September and will close on October 11th. Also, as shared, the CSI LEA reporting, if you receive CSI funds, your expenditure reports are due by October 31st. And as what was shared today with the LCAP dashboard upload, again, this is extremely important that your folks that are the ones responsible to go onto My CDE Connect, that they know the window opens on October 14th and closes on November 1st. The LCAP, let's see, in-person instruction IPI grants. Again, this one, the expenditure report closes on the December 1st. And just a note that if you do not submit this, you have to forfeit all funds apportioned. So again, we want to keep this, you want to keep this on your radar for upcoming things. And again, sharing it with those that this pertains so that you will meet all your deadlines. And just know this is not an exhaustive list. And so as we end our meeting, again, we want to welcome you to the new school year. We want to thank you for being here today. We ask that you complete the evaluation for today's meeting, either going to the link or following the QR code and letting us know what are some topics. We won't be meeting again until, on the next slide, I believe November 7th. We do have the CASFEP conference coming up in October. Excuse me. So we will be meeting in November with our next state and federal programs directors meeting. So again, we wanted to thank you. Please fill out that the survey and evaluation and let us know what are some topics that you would need to know, you would like to know about, and we will definitely support you in any way we can. So again, have a great weekend, great day, and welcome back. Thank you.